There's only one thing that a person can do most of their time, and that's work. You can have fun sometimes, but working is what shapes our time.
I'm Mitch.
And I'm Missy.
We're coworkers.
He's the boss, and we're married.
And she's the boss. Together, we host Good Faith Weekly, a podcast on faith and culture.
What could possibly go wrong?
Tune in and find out. Missy. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up, talk a little bit about the labor movement, and then later on in the pod, we're going to sit down with labor attorney from Louisville, Kentucky, Chris Sanders. And then at the end of the pod, I'm going to talk about how labor is connected to our faith. So we think you're really going to enjoy this pod, so stay tuned. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm hot.
Yeah, same.
I mean, it's the dog days, and so we've beat this horse to death, so it's just hot.
Thank you for joining us for our weekly weather report.
let me look out the window right now. Yep, it's hot.
Yes, our flowers are burning, and yes, it's very, very hot. So
Yep.
anyways, so we have some things to talk about.
Okay, let's go. Let's do it.
The Women's World Cup is happening.
It is. You're absolutely right.
I know. Aren't you impressed?
I'm so impressed.
And
I didn't know that you were
very
following.
impressed with this segue.
Okay.
I mean,
give it to me. Let me hear
I've
it.
been doing this a year now, so I'm basically an expert, right?
Yeah, of course you are. It has been a year. Congratulations.
Thanks. Did you bring me a gift?
Yes.
I bet. Anywho. So our U.S. women are still in it, from what I understand.
Yes, they're in the group stage. They did not win their group, which was kind of surprising.
Yeah, so they're in it, but they're not as successful as they were expected to be.
Well, they've dominated. Oh, I mean, they've dominated for so many years right now, and so anything less than domination is kind of a letdown.
But in another subject, our former president, has a hat trick.
Wow.
See what I did there?
That took 90 minutes of soccer, but yeah, we got there. I get it. Jeez, that was a long way for a hat trick joke.
He has 3 now indictments. I had to Google that because I wasn't sure. But when I saw 3, we had to go with a hat trick.
Sure.
Am I wrong?
No,
it
not
had
at all.
To be a hat trick. So I don't know that we have anything else to add to the conversation. I just really wanted to get that punchline in.
Well, you did nice. So, yes, our former president, Donald J. Trump, has been indicted for a 3rd time. This time, though, the first 2 are pretty serious charges. This one, this is going all in. He's got to go to D.C. this week. By the time this podcast drops, he had been arraigned in Washington, D.C. on Thursday of basically conspiracy to overthrow an election, and they're co-conspirators in this, Giuliani being one of them. So it's interesting. Poor Don.
Yeah, it's real difficult, unfortunately, to continue to get, I don't know, the kind of reaction and the weightiness of what's going on, because it's happening over and over again.
But to me, that is one of, I think history will determine the Trump error as what he has.
Did you say error? Because I like that.
Yeah, well, it fits. Is that he has normalized bigotry, racism, alternative facts, misinformation, breaking the law as long as it suits your political purposes. He's normalized all this. Think about it for a second. We have a former sitting U.S. president indicted 3 times now. That blows my mind.
It is pretty crazy.
This is the seat that George Washington held, that Thomas Jefferson held, that Abraham Lincoln held, that JFK held, that Ronald Reagan held. The list goes on. This is just, I mean, it's embarrassing. It's infuriating. And to be honest with you, I've grown less and less interested in this story as time passed. But if he is truly guilty, which, I mean, we all saw it with our own eyes and heard it with our own ears, he needs to go to prison.
I know, and I know you didn't really want to talk about it, but I had a good punchline, so we had to go.
Well, I mean, hey, we got to spend the first 4 minutes just for the hat trick joke.
We did. So, but on today's episode, we're going to be talking to
Chris Sanders, labor lawyer,
about all of the strikes going on. And then we're going to, in the end, talk about how this is directly impacting our family. Mm-hmm. But before we get started...
Oh, is there a quiz coming?
Not exactly. But much like when we talked about the debt ceiling, turns out not a lot of fun facts on the internet about labor strikes.
It's not the sexiest topic in the world,
however,
but very, very important.
I did, because you were busy watching the movie, that I did manage to find a few little factoids that I thought might be fun for us to talk about before we go into the interview.
All right, shoot.
So did you know that strikes have been recorded on papyrus as early as the 12th century BCE, when Egyptian artisans refused to work on pharaohs' tombs? Strikes are extremely popular, in fact, in France, where the workers often strike for the right to strike.
Really? Well, I bet the problem in Egypt, it was just too dang hot, just like it is today.
Relatable, right? So
that's very interesting. I had no idea.
Do you know why a labor stoppage is called a strike?
No, please.
Okay, so in 1768, English sailors, unhappy about a wage cut, expressed their anger by taking down or striking the sails on ships in the port of London.
Wow. There you go.
I had no
Look at
idea.
you, full of jokes and information.
I know. I just like a whole package.
You
right?
are the whole package.
Okay. So then we talked to Chris, and one of the questions we are going to ask him, spoiler alert, is how people of faith can impact advocating for workers and workers' rights. Well, I did find an example in which people of faith kind of worked against, well, one example, there's probably several, but one in particular where they worked against. So.
I was going to say, there are numerous examples.
I
Carry
grew up
on.
in the 80s, I'm aware. Okay, so in the late 1940s, the Airline Pilots Association reached an agreement with the National Airlines after airline executive Ted Baker attended a religious retreat and came to the realization that and called pilots to ask for forgiveness, attributing the discord to the, quote, power of Satan. So this executive went away on a religious retreat, and apparently the Lord spoketh and saith unto him that these pilots who wanted, fair wages were actually under the power of Satan.
Well, there you go.
So in this next, I'm trying to decide if I save this for the end. This next little factoid may get cut, but I can't not tell you this. So apparently, and I'm going to butcher some of these pronunciations, the skilled artisans at Deir el Medina working for Pharaoh Ramses III. Mm-hmm. You remember him?
Yeah,
right?
just barely.
I'm sure you know his story.
Yeah, I knew 2 better, but yeah, I got 3.
Okay, so 3. You should know 3, and you will never forget him after this.
Right.
So apparently they did not receive their wages as expected 1 month in the year 1158 BC. Mm-hmm. So they walked off the job and into history with what is commonly considered the first recorded labor action. Mm-hmm. The pharaoh, a militaristic ruler who enjoyed cutting off the penises of enemy captives, scrambled to appease the workers. Why, you ask?
Do I dare? Do I dare ask?
Sit with them for a minute. Sit with us for a minute. The artisans were building his tomb, and as it turns out, ensuring that your boss can safely pass into the eternal life puts you in a strong bargaining position. So, do we need to unpack this a moment?
No, I think I got it.
But what courage did it take for those workers to walk off the job knowing what his punishment might be?
Yeah.
That was a huge gamble.
Yeah. At least for some of them.
I'm guessing they were all men.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Yeah. Okay. Interesting factoid.
Okay. So I went down the rabbit hole, and of course, much of the labor movement and strikes, point you towards Labor Day.
Yes.
Yes, which I found a little fact that kind of relates to everything I knew about Labor Day growing up, which was, can you wear white after Labor Day? I know it seems unrelated, but that's what I guess this speaks to.
That has been a staple in our house ever since we got married.
Right, but that speaks to the fact that I grew up not understanding the labor movement or where it came from.
The importance of Labor Day, yeah.
Right. I've learned that in recent times, but it's funny how that connected itself to the labor movement. But this old tradition goes back to the late Victorian era, where it was a fashion faux pas to wear any white clothing after the summer officially ended on Labor Day. It says the tradition isn't really followed anymore, except in our house.
Yes.
But the reason you didn't wear white after Labor Day is because that indicated you were still on vacation mode at your summer cottage.
That's very European.
Yeah. Well, we're not in our summer. I guess once we return from our summer cottage, we no longer wear white.
Sure.
So anyways, I just thought that was a funny, sort of related, but maybe not related. Anyways, so I also found out that according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that there were 14.8 million union members in the workforce in 2017, and that is down from 17.7 million in 1983. So it's definitely...
Yeah, it's gone down. I mean, there's been attacks on unions and union busting politicians all across the country trying to vilify what unions are. But the reality is, if it wasn't for unions, we would not have a lot of the important labor laws that we have today.
It's true. I'm learning a lot. Like I said, grew up in the 80s in a time where anytime unions were talked about, it was very much an eye roll kind of thing.
Sure.
And so that was the taste I had for unions. It's been yet again another point of deconstructing as an adult, of learning the importance of unions and workers' rights and the ability to collectively come together and say this is unfair practice in our workplace. I found on the Economic Policy Institute that in 2021, and I know we've all heard these big numbers, but CEOs were paid 399 times as much as a typical worker.
Wow.
So, it's just, it's hard to look at those kinds of things and not think that the ability to unionize and bring about labor contracts and things, is not important.
Right.
It obviously is, because even with that in existence, we still have numbers like these.
Yeah. And that's a good segue into our interview with Chris Sanders. Chris is a labor lawyer, and with all of the strikes and potential strikes on the horizon right now going into the end of summer, early fall, he comes to kind of talk to us about what's going on in the country, the reason and purpose behind these strikes, and the importance for people of faith to support organized labor because it is an ethical problem that we have in this country and one that we need to solve. So it's a good conversation.
Absolutely. And I know you have some thoughts afterwards. So
I do. I've got some really good thoughts.
I know you do.
Well,
All
I don't know if they're good or not.
We'll
but,
talk some more about
interesting.
Ramses the third.
No, we're done with poor Ramses. We're on to Ramses the fourth.
All right. Stay tuned.
Baptist Women in Ministry is celebrating its 40th anniversary in 2023. Baptist Women in Ministry, BWIM, will gather in Louisville, Kentucky, October 2nd through the 4th to celebrate. Louisville, it's where BWIM's founding mothers met 40 years ago to begin the movement. The celebration will include the premiere of a documentary about BWIM's founding, plenary sessions, times of worship, connection and self-care, and a banquet to honor BWIM's four mothers. Join Baptist Women in Ministry this October in Louisville. Learn more and register at bwim.info. Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us all the way from Louisville, Kentucky. Chris Sanders is a lawyer for working people. He is active in law, labor, faith, and politics. Practicing law is one of the tools in his toolbox, along with networking, strategy, and consulting. Before law school, Chris studied theology. He is still active in church and even preaches once in a while. His education includes a JD from the University of Louisville School of Law, Master's of Divinity from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a Bachelor's of Arts from Georgetown College. He serves on many councils within Louisville and across the nation, dealing with faith and labor movements. And Chris, we are delighted that you are here with us on Good Faith Weekly.
Hi, Mitch and Missy. It's really great to see y'all.
It's great to see you as well. So, Chris, before we jump into current labor issues, I want to hear more about your path. What led you from a very lucrative and prestigious career with that divinity degree to a law practice? And with your education in both, help us connect a biblical foundation for why people of faith should advocate for fair labor practices.
That's great. Well, thanks for the question. And it's great to be with Good Faith Media. I'm a faithful reader and listener and sustainer. So I was in seminary, went to seminary more as a activist than a church vocational pastor. I was in seminary and looking for paths to do that. And there just wasn't enough. So I went to law school. While in law school, looking for opportunities to be active in social justice. In my last semester of law school, in God's providence, one of my professors says, there's a labor union that's looking for a lawyer. Now, I'm smart enough, but I was no great shakes in law school. So I threw them a resume. They only got 3 resumes, and they picked me. And that was in the 80s, and here I am today. And as to the lucrative part, I like to say I went into law not trying to make a lot of money, and so far I'm a success.
Excellent.
That's awesome. Well, Chris, you've got this divinity degree from Southern Seminary there in Louisville, and now you got a law degree. One of the things that I have been inspired by your work and the work of others is working on labor issues from a faith perspective. Can you help our audience understand why that's so important?
There's only one thing that a person can do most of their time, and that's work. You can have fun sometimes. You can sleep sometimes if you're able to sleep. But working is what shapes our time. I follow a workplace providing agency that's called 80,000 hours. 80,000 hours is 2,000 hours a year for 40 years.
Wow.
And so 80,000 hours kind of gives shape to what we do with ourselves most of the time. Millions of people work, but they hate their jobs. They don't like what they do. And there's only a small percentage of us for whom work is a calling, where we get to work at our mission. For most people who are working in either, the down and out part of employment or in the up and out of employment, it's just life, a way to make some money so that they can live otherwise. And so with all that, if work is good, hard work, wonderful. But if work is toil, if work is meaningless, then we have to find the meaning in the work that we do, or else we have to make it better. I've focused upon trying to make work better for a long time. And that's partly about money. That's partly about time. That's partly about the conditions of work, whether it's hot or it's cold or it's hard or it's painful, whether it is long-term or short-term, so that people of faith ought to be watching for times when our 80,000 hours are turned into toil and exploitation. Mm-hmm. In the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, we look to the stories of the Exodus. They're the very guts of the reason a Hebrew people came together as a people, where in the Exodus, people are working, people in apartheid type conditions, a subculture serving a dominant minority, and they want life to be better. Instead, the dominant minority cracks down on them, and through escalating tension, ultimately that relationship breaks down, and the children of Israel have to leave. I've thought about this too from the New Testament perspective. Jesus is a prophet. Under the Roman Empire, there wasn't much room for collective action. If Jesus had been a prophet in American democracy, we might have more stories of collective action and the freedom to speak truth, especially speak truth to power. But I do think that Jesus, standing in the shoes of the prophets of old, of his old, that we can see in the life and ultimate martyrdom of Jesus, a reason why it is that Jesus stood with folks who were experiencing challenge when work is toil, when work is exploitive, and had an important word to say about that. And people were inspired by that. Yeah. And resisted.
He used labor examples a lot, Chris, when telling parables and teaching truths about spiritual truths that were very relatable to what was going on in his day. It's almost like he had a working knowledge of how it was to toil in labor back then. So appreciate that. Let's move on to what's going on today, because I do think that there is a theological framework of what's going on today and why people of faith need to be interested in these labor issues. Now, from Hollywood to UPS, there are a lot of labor disputes across the country right now. Can you tell us a little bit about all these issues at play? And was this an expectation coming out of a global pandemic? Because it seems as though a lot of these labor disputes have to do with the changes that took place in society and culture that somehow influenced the way the labor market now operates.
This is probably, in my time in organized labor since the 80s, this is probably the most significant time of large-scale strikes that I've ever seen. Somebody was doing the math on this. Had the Teamsters gone out on strike with 340,000 Teamsters who work for the United Parcel Service, another 160,000 who are actors and more under the SAG-AFTRA agreement, another 12,000 writers in the entertainment industry, and then strikes which are happening, which are a lot less known. Somebody has estimated they're probably in the nature of, I forgot about the United Auto Workers, whose contract expires in mid-September. Something on the order of 750,000 workers who either are on strike, might have gone on strike, or could go on strike in this 3 or 4 month period that we're in. And I think it has a lot to do with coming out of the pandemic and the restlessness that goes with that. That caused a lot of work dislocation in people's minds and hearts. It also has to do with changes in these industries. Writers are concerned about computers doing their job and writing for them. So the writers are on strike about AI starting to do the work, the creative work that they've been doing, and that their work is now shorter term because of so much being produced for the streaming services as opposed to being produced for film and television, which had a much longer work life. Writing is more like gig work than it is long-term retention. Acting's very much the same in concerns about streaming and residuals, which is a way that performers get paid long after they've actually performed. That's a big thing. The Teamsters under the United Parcel Service are part of this whole industry that has burgeoned as a result of the pandemic. Delivery services are just huge now, and that's never going to change back. Those of us who get our as consumers get our packages delivered by UPS and Amazon, DHL, and more, are relying upon the people who fly the planes, the people who load the planes, people who load the trucks, people move those trucks across the country and put them in delivery vehicles, take them to your door. The Teamsters have a goodly number of full-time workers, and they were concerned about forced overtime because there are too few full-time jobs, and they're working a lot of overtime. So the new contract limits, or I think actually does away with forced overtime. The women and men who drive the trucks were working in the heat, so now those trucks are going to have air conditioning.
Wait, they didn't have air conditioning?
Did not have air conditioning. Imagine being in places like Texas and Oklahoma.
It was interesting that you say that, because I was just driving down the street here in Norman, Oklahoma the other day, and I saw, I think it was a FedEx truck, and I didn't even think about it. It had open door, and the driver, who was the delivery person, was just driving. There was literally no door right there.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And in the back where the packages are, there's actually a thermometer in the package car. One of those that went around the internet showing that package compartment at 134 degrees.
Oh my goodness.
So this is the UPS drivers dealing with climate change because it's just so darn hot in some of those package cars. And then, because we are relying now upon deliveries like never before, those folks who do a lot of the loading and delivering needed a raise. The new contract starts everybody with at least a $2.75 increase, up to starting at $21. Everybody gets that, and then over the length of the agreement, over 5 years, $7.50. These are big increases in my world. I've negotiated plenty of contracts where we're negotiating for nickels and dimes. Right. The fact that the Teamsters were able to negotiate an agreement with UPS management for dollars shows just how much they were behind and just how much America relies upon these deliveries. It's a $30 billion contract.
So, Chris, what I'm hearing you say is that there is hope that some of these labor disputes are going to get resolved just because of the demand out there right now.
Yeah. And America believes in organized labor like never before. I've had times in my career when support for labor unions has been under 50%. Half of America didn't like what I did for a living. That number is now at 70%. If amongst younger people, it approaches 90%. So that the companies know that in these struggles, when they're up again in these moments before a strike might actually happen, that America is on labor's side.
Great.
That's a whole new level.
So, do you have hope for the writers and actors?
We've got a personal stake in this.
We do, and we'll talk about that after the interview, after an outro. But yes,
one of our boys is a writer, Chris. Just so you know.
What do you see happening?
I really do. America loves its entertainment, and the concern for those folks who produce created and creative content, I think, is real as America is anxious about AI. So in this dislocation between, live producers and computerized content, I think that public sentiment is on the side of the people who do the creative work. I think that the companies are enormously profitable, by the billions. Mm-hmm. And so that they can say, well, we don't have the money, but yet their own CEO puts the lie to that. I do think that they're going to reach an agreement. There's more pressure from the acting side than there is from the writer's side, just because the timeline is shorter for the actors than it is for the writers in terms of producing material. And as the actors are in solidarity, as the content is starting to turn over faster and faster. We seem to get more and more content faster and faster. There's going to be a need to resolve this sooner than later.
So, Chris, my next question, and if you need to take a minute to think about this one, that's okay. But I was wondering if you could give us an example of how people of faith have maybe worked to change specific policies or practices of a company or a governmental agency throughout mm-hmm. history. Like, give us some tangible examples if you have any.
I'm going to reach back into history. Then I'm going to tell you about some more current stuff. In times in America, the stories of organized labor have been wrapped up in the stories of peoplehood, particularly around ethnicity. When in the years when America's workforce was dominated by, for example, Irish and German and Eastern European immigrants, those folks relied heavily upon their Catholic parishes and Catholic priests for inspiration. There was whenever I first got involved in this work, there was a sense of the labor priest as a person who was always on the side of the people in, of course, his parish whenever it came time to speak a word. That's less and less so true now. But what I've seen more of lately in labor community religious solidarity has been the progressive activists who are not tied to any particular denomination or expression of faith, but have found inspiration and have found themselves speaking out before or during labor disputes. One of the places that happens is in Labor Community Religious Coalition. I represent a national organization called Jobs with Justice. If you want to look online, it's jwj.org. We have 42 coalitions in 26 states. Hopefully there is a JWJ coalition near where your listeners are. In those places, people of faith are often standing physically in solidarity when there are rallies, press conferences, demonstrations, strikes, and they go to the microphone with a word from the Lord. Sometimes that takes expression with more high-profile people in sign-on letters, in public statements that make their way into the national media. I can't say enough about how inspiring it is on the ground when a pastor or a woman religious, a seminary student comes out, speaks from the heart, links arms with people who are in this kind of moment of existential struggle and sometimes doubt. It really, really matters that a person is there that says, yeah, if Jesus were here, Jesus would be out here.
Right.
It really matters.
Yeah. And people of faith, I mean, from a theological construct, Chris, I mean, we develop our ethics and our morals and values guided by that theological construct. And I just think about some of the issues throughout history and even today. Even today, I cannot believe this, but the issue of child labor has returned, and how many hours a child can work and, what, defines a child and all of that. It's because of people of faith and their ability to stand up to greed and corporational oppression on people, that people are saying, no, this is not right, and you need to change your policies. We're not going to we're not going to buy into your services or buy your goods because you are doing something that is detestable to us. I think, decades ago when we began to learn about the clothing industry and the sweatshops that these children were, living in, producing some of the brand clothing that we put on our bodies, and people of faith and other people said, no, this is not right. And so I think there are example after example of that taking place. I only hope that we can continue kind of using our faith as an advocacy tool to make certain that the private markets uphold a responsibility of just being human and taking care of everybody else. And so there's so many issues right now. I just think, especially with this heat going on right now. In fact, if I don't stop right now, Missy's going to file a complaint because we're out of AC right now in the studio. So she may file a complaint.
We're unionizing here at Good Faith Media. That's really why we had you on here today, Chris.
That's right. Yeah. She needs to retain you, Chris.
That's right.
But yeah.
Exploitation comes from cheap labor.
Yeah.
As long as cheap labor is available, that's where capitalism is going to go.
Mm-hmm.
There are some employers, and I like to advise them whenever they let me, that do take the high road.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually some movement in corporate life toward, making sure that it lives up to its own statements and mission statements.
Right.
Whenever it says that people are our most important part, that they live up to that.
That's awesome.
I do believe that there are corporations that are doing a really good job of that. I've advised some businesses, some more for-profits and some large nonprofits about their unionized workforces to help them, embrace the union
mm-hmm.
as opposed to see it as, an internal enemy. That's unfortunately still kind of the exception because capitalism, leans toward cheap labor,
mm-hmm.
especially in times when labor is tight. The reason we're seeing a rise in child labor is because there's been a labor shortage. If you got a labor shortage, you go to non-traditional sources of labor.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you end up with 15-year-old kids working in factories.
Right.
When I see 14-year-old kids die in industrial accidents because they got no business being there, but the companies need help.
Mm-hmm.
And so they go get it any place they can get it.
Yeah. Well, Chris, you mentioned a couple of the organizations that you worked with, Jobs Justice and Interfaith Worker Justice. How can our listeners get involved in the work that some of these organizations are doing? You said that hopefully there is an organization in their area, but how can they find out more about these organizations?
Go to the website for Jobs with Justice, jwj.org, to find a coalition near you. If you're a member of a labor union, get active in your union. If you feel like you're part of a bunch of workers who need representation, give me a call. We'll help you find a union. We'll help you. Corporate America says we're the job creators. Government says we are the job providers through economic development. Labor unions are the organizations say that where jobs become good jobs, become places where jobs aren't just jobs, but jobs with justice.
I love that.
So, Chris, thank you for joining us today. And before we let you go, I've got one last question. As you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So in light of our conversation today and the work that you do, what is your more to tell?
I think this is a tremendous time for folks to embrace organized labor as people of faith, to see Jesus as a profit in the workplace and not just in their personal lives. So that I'm hopeful that this moment of embracing labor unions will also be a chance for people of faith to embrace labor too. Mm. And whether that's on your own job, as a responsible employer, as an investor, that in all these places that we will be, extending good labor standards and good labor and dignity and respect into all portions of our lives, including our lives of faith.
Well said, sir. Chris Sanders, lawyer, advocate, theologian, deacon, and sometimes preacher.
And band member too, right?
And band member, that's right. Chris, thanks so much for joining us this week on Good Faith Weekly. I'm always fascinated, Missy, when we talk to Chris about labor, because I forget about its importance in the world. Often we get so busy doing our thing and forget about these incredible workers out there day in, day out, doing their job, and really need to be compensated for it.
I'm a little more fascinated by the theologian/attorney combination. Sorry.
We've run across that quite often these days.
Yes. Anyways, sorry, I didn't mean to derail you there. But no. I know you have thoughts. I know you were excited to have this conversation afterwards to help form or continue on the conversation with Chris about the biblical stance on labor and in particular kind of how Jesus fits in the mix. I mean, we always talk about what would Jesus do, and we kind of like filtering everything through his life as we seek to study and be more like him. So impart the wisdom.
I don't know if it's any wisdom, but I do have a lot of thoughts about it. So let's kind of take a step back. And at the beginning of the pod, you mentioned about growing up in the 80s, and there was a lot of talk in your house, outside of your house, just in your environment about what labor was. Well, the same thing occurred in my house, and it kind of came two schools of thought. I had the labor side of things in my house. I've talked about my grandfather and all the things he meant to me, who worked for Tulsa Public Schools, who was a mechanic and did all kinds of things. And for him, labor and unions were very, very important. And then I had others who were on the management side that saw the problems with organized labor. So, I didn't really, I just listened a lot growing up. But then I began to realize the importance of organized labor because, quite frankly, that companies are made of individuals. Individuals fall prey to greed and power and lust. And a lot of times that trickles down to the workers and the labor force. So there has to be a united front on the labor side to make certain that their rights and their
safety protection,
wages, everything, their interests are taken care of. And so I knew the social, political, and reasoning behind organized labor. Mm-hmm. But I never understood if there was a connection with that and my faith. And then I began to do a deeper dive into the study of organized labor, looking at labor all throughout Scripture. And believe it or not, Missy, when you read the Bible, there are stories of laborers everywhere, through the Old Testament and the New Testament. I mean, you think about the Old Testament, of course, the Hebrew slaves immediately pop up as they are enslaved in Egypt, and the Pharaoh uses their slavery to build his incredible cities. You move on to the fields, and you got the story of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz. You've got other stories. I mean, it's just one after the other about labor. And even in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, there are certain laws that are in place of how people can treat their employees and their laborers and what you're supposed to do when you work. So there's this ethical guideline that should guide us when it comes to labor and employment. And then I get to the New Testament. And this is what really blew my mind when I began to study the person of Jesus Christ. So Jesus was born to whom? Mary. And Jesus' earthly father was?
Joseph.
What do we know about Joseph?
He was a carpenter.
He was a carpenter. Now, when we think of carpenter, Missy, what do we think of?
I mean, some hot guy on HGTV.
Yeah, that guy.
That's probably not the answer you were looking for, right?
I was thinking more Bob Vila, the Yankee carpenter, or something like that.
Okay, well, yes, let's go with that.
We
Sorry,
think of
rewind. I think of Bob Vila.
We think of a professional carpenter who is employed, who's a contractor, who comes in, builds stuff, does things like that. But that's not the case. Jesus was a resident of Nazareth. So was Mary and Joseph. Scholars remind us that Joseph was most likely a day laborer.
Yeah, that's something we've talked about before, and that's one of those little kind of, I don't know, in passing facts, but it completely changes your frame of mind.
Yep.
Because again, growing up when we did, and my childhood was mostly in the 80s, and everything was whitewashed and everything was painted so romantically. And Joseph was working on this amazing cabinetry.
Right. Yeah. That's another thing. You're thinking he's making chivarros there.
Right. So it is that
hanging shingle out in Nazareth. That's not the case.
But that's the image you get
Right.
in your mind. And this is why, just perception is so important. And then when you all of a sudden say day labor, what image do you get in your mind? It's a completely different picture.
Completely different. So if your father is a day laborer, guess what you're going to be?
A day laborer.
So Jesus, the carpenter, is really Jesus, the day laborer.
Right.
So tell me what you think his experience was growing up and seeing his father in this industry and then him participating in this industry.
Well, I'm guessing he probably saw him taken advantage of.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, especially if you're amongst other day laborers who are competing to get a job, the only thing you can do is continue to take less and less and work longer hours and harder, so.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, for a day laborer, it's all about work that day. And so if I'm somebody trying to get something done and I come and try to hire somebody and there's a group of you sitting around, the Lowe's at Nazareth, for example, and you start bidding a job, it's going to go to the lowest bidder most likely.
Right.
And so you see how Jesus witnessed this from Joseph and then his experience as Joseph's, son of what that must have been like. And so he saw this industry being taken advantage of, maybe not working in the best conditions,
well, he
so to
probably
speak.
saw his a lot of this in his community.
Right. Yeah, because when you are a day laborer, guess what? You hang out with day laborers.
Right.
And so he heard the stories.
There was no 401k, as Phoebe says. In
Right,
Friends.
exactly. And so he heard all of the horror stories. He heard everything that was going on. And so as he begins to think about, leaving the industry of a day laborer and going out to be a traveling rabbi, all of these experiences formulated his theological conviction. And I know about all the Son of God stuff and all of that, but in a very real, contextual, historical, human sense, these experiences shaped the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus, the day laborer, becomes Jesus, the rabbi. So labor helps mold Jesus to who he becomes. And so when you begin to read about the parables, the story of the vineyard workers, the story of, throwing seeds, across the land, you're doing so through the eyes of a day laborer. He's telling those stories based upon the experiences and knowledge he has. And so it really was, just blew my mind when I began to think about Jesus, the day laborer, as Jesus the rabbi teaching these lessons. No wonder Jesus was so adamant about welcoming the stranger, so adamant about equality and inclusiveness and justice to make certain that everybody was treated with dignity, respect, and equality because of his experience as a day laborer.
Absolutely. One thing I thought of when you were first talking about, or when we were talking earlier about the labor movement,
Mm-hmm.
and it kind of hit me that the parallel, well, please don't think this is not a false equivalency here, but I thought about kind of the justification we use for racism. And, we don't have that anymore because we had the Civil Rights Act. We had, we had all that. It's done and over. And I feel like that's a similar parallel to the labor movement, because when I was growing up and taught about the early, the turn of the century and fighting for workers' rights and things like child labor and, getting to a 40-hour work week and all those things. So you think, okay, that's done. It's over. Why do we need unions, or why do we need, folks who do advocate for workers' rights? And it's not over and done. It's a constant, because as we have seen in the numbers I, presented earlier about CEOs with, making 399 times what the average worker does, that those on top, like we've said before, are going to fight to stay on top, and they're not going to give up their power and their wealth easily. And so it is a continual struggle. It's a continual tension, but it is something that as people of faith, like you said, we have to be aware of, we have to be advocating for continually. If we get lazy, if we get complacent, then that's when some of those, those rights, or that's when people start getting taken advantage of and exploited.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, the civil rights movement flows parallel with the labor movement. In fact, we always have to be reminded that when MLK goes to Memphis to march, he's going there on the heels of the civil rights marches, as well as the voting rights law, civil rights law, not in that particular order, but he's going there to march with sanitation workers.
Yes.
For labor.
For labor, yes.
And so the importance is that this is a faith issue. This is an ethical issue, that our faith and understanding of our faith should shape our advocacy and our policy regarding labor. And another thing, I mean, don't think for a second that this isn't directly connected to race and systemic racism precisely, because you start thinking about all those individuals in these corporations who are at the lower paying jobs within these corporations. A majority of them are brown and black people. And I hate to use that color characterization, but they're of Hispanic heritage and African heritage. Marginalized groups, exactly right. And so, yes, it still is a direct correlation between systemic racism and labor. Labor, or corporations and companies, are always going to try to take advantage of the less fortunate, the marginalized, and try to get as much labor as they can without paying for it.
Right. So now circling, we mentioned it earlier. I feel like we need to follow up how the strikes of today are affecting us.
Yes, they are.
So, we have a kiddo out in Los Angeles who works in the film industry. Went to college, got his degree, went out to LA to try to work and be a writer, of all things. Mm-hmm. Not a great time to be a writer. But, and even though he is not in the union,
well, you have to have so many qualifications to get in the union. He's not earning those qualifications yet.
However, he's been working on projects that have come to a halt, mm-hmm. because you cannot work on any projects, if you want future union membership. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how, probably can't share a whole lot of details. All that to say that this kind of thing trickles down to so many people. And so now our kiddo, who was doing well enough for,
paying his bills.
He was paying his bills, mid-20s, for struggling, as you do out there in LA, is now really struggling and he has zero power to do anything about this. Yeah. And it's a stressor on us. It's heartbreaking to see kids like him and even adults, people, God forbid, that have families and things like that are trying to survive. And you think, oh, this is Hollywood, this is writers, this is, and no, your average writer is not making that much money, and they're a gig, economy, basically. They're going from gig to gig and hoping to get work. And we have to think about how much we rely on the arts and how much we need the arts in all forms. And this is part of that.
Right. Yeah. And, like and you said it well, that a lot of times when we do think of Hollywood, we do think of the upper echelon of Hollywood, the stars, the rich, with the powerful, the wealthy. But the reality is, to make movies, to make television, to make good art, it takes an incredible cast of characters to do that.
And most of them are not the folks you see on the cover of that magazine.
Yeah, a vast majority of them are not.
The directors, the writers, none of them. They're just trying to do enough work, again, to stay in a union or to get in a union, to get insurance and all of those things.
So when you hear those people out there saying, I just wish these actors would shut up and, go back to work, those actors are not speaking on their own behalf. They are going to be fine. They know they're going to be fine.
Right.
They're speaking for their community and the vast majority of people who help bring their art to life.
And I saw a picture the other day of Nick Offerman on the in the picket line with the SAG, the writers, and his sign. His caption was, if it's not on the page, it's not on the stage.
Right.
And I just thought, it's just something we need to remember, that the arts are important, but also how those arts are developed, and brought to the stage or brought to the screen. This affects real people in real time, and right now it happens to be affecting us in a very real and very scary way.
Yeah. And, thankfully, we have the ability to make sure he's going to be okay. I just think about all of the people in this industry as well as other industries when strikes go on that, really, really, really struggle. And so our thoughts and our prayers, our hearts go out to them. We hope that the better angels rise up among these communities and we can get some deals done so that people can go back to work, because that's what they want to do. They want to work and create.
Absolutely.
Well, it's been a good episode.
I hope.
You think we can not talk about the heat next week?
Maybe. No, I think we'll still be talking about it. Maybe we'll have air conditioning by then. That would be lovely.
Yeah. Well, day 22 without air conditioning. So, but who's counting?
That's right. We're both still surviving and haven't killed one another. So that's the win.
Well, I could be AI. You have no idea. I could be holed up somewhere in a closet. Come let me out.
That's right.
All right. Everybody have a great week. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.